I never told my in-laws what I inherited. They tried to buy me out at Thanksgiving. The first time my mother-in-law tried to put a price on my life, she smiled while passing me the mashed potatoes. Nobody else at the Thanksgiving table noticed the way her fingers lingered on the serving bowl or how my father-in-law exchanged a quick glance with my husband before clearing his throat. The dining room glowed with warm lights, the turkey filled the air with familiar smells, and everyone laughed as if this were another perfect family holiday. But I had spent enough years around the Carter family to recognize the silence that came before one of their carefully planned ambushes. "Emily," my father-in-law Richard said, lifting his glass with the polished confidence that had helped him build a regional construction company from nothing, "we've been talking about your future." My husband, Daniel, stared at his plate instead of me. That single movement sent a cold warning through my chest. Daniel always met my eyes when something mattered. Tonight, he couldn't. Richard folded his napkin with military precision before continuing. "You're a smart woman. You deserve security." Across the table, my sister-in-law Vanessa flashed the same rehearsed smile she wore whenever she wanted something. "We've all agreed," she said sweetly, "that it's time to simplify things." My pulse slowed instead of racing. People panic when surprises hit them. I become quieter. That habit came from my grandfather, Colonel James Whitmore, who had taught me that the calmest person in the room usually controlled the ending. Nobody at that table knew his name meant anything to me. Nobody knew that after he died 8 months earlier, I inherited more than old photographs and medals. I had never mentioned the private trust, the controlling shares in Whitmore Defense Technologies, or the confidential letter locked inside my safe. Grandfather had written only one instruction in bold ink: never reveal who you are until someone shows you exactly who they are. So I smiled politely, reached for the cranberry sauce, and waited while my husband's family unknowingly stepped onto the stage they had built for themselves. Richard slid a thick envelope across the polished oak table until it stopped beside my dinner plate. "Open it," he said. Around us, forks stopped moving. Even Daniel finally looked up, but his face wasn't excited. It was nervous. That frightened me far more than the envelope. Inside rested legal documents, a cashier's check for $200,000, and a contract prepared by an expensive law firm. I read every page without saying a word. Vanessa couldn't hide her excitement anymore. "It's generous," she blurted out. "Most people would sign before dessert." My eyes continued scanning the pages. The agreement required me to give up every future claim involving Daniel's finances, our jointly purchased home, and any marital assets if we ever divorced. Even stranger, it required me to transfer ownership of the lake cabin my late grandmother had left me before our marriage. That cabin wasn't worth millions, but it sat beside hundreds of acres recently purchased by an anonymous investment group. Suddenly the puzzle pieces started connecting. Richard wasn't protecting his son. He wanted my property. "Why today?" I finally asked. Richard leaned back confidently. "Because family handles business face to face." Daniel swallowed hard. "Emily, maybe just listen." I turned toward him. "Did you know about this?" He hesitated 1 second too long. Dad thought. That was enough. My husband had known. The room became painfully quiet until Richard laughed softly. "You're making this emotional." This is just smart planning. I folded the contract carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Who owns the investment company buying land around my cabin? I asked. Vanessa nearly dropped her wineglass. Richard answered too quickly. Irrelevant. It wasn't irrelevant. It was the only question that mattered. Before anyone spoke again, the front doorbell rang. Richard frowned. We're not expecting anyone. A housekeeper hurried toward the foyer while everyone remained frozen. Seconds later, an older man wearing an expensive navy overcoat stepped into the dining room carrying a leather briefcase. Silver hair. Perfect posture. Sharp eyes that missed nothing. I recognized him immediately. Harold Bennett. My grandfather's attorney for nearly 30 years. Richard stood. Can I help you? Harold ignored him completely. Instead, he looked directly at me and smiled with unmistakable respect. Miss Whitmore, he said clearly enough for everyone to hear, I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but your office has been trying to reach you for over an hour. The board refused to vote without their chairwoman present. Every fork, every glass, every breath around that table stopped. Daniel looked at me as though he had never seen me before. Richard's confident expression cracked for the first time all evening. I met Harold's eyes with the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. He understood instantly. Forgive me, he added smoothly. Perhaps I've arrived at the wrong address. Then he handed me a sealed folder before quietly leaving. Nobody spoke until the front door closed. Richard forced a laugh that sounded painfully fake. Chairwoman, he asked. Of what exactly? I rested the unopened folder beside my plate instead of answering. The silence stretched so long that even the grandchildren stopped whispering. Daniel reached toward the folder, but I calmly placed my hand over it first. Not tonight, I said. Richard's smile returned, though thinner than before. Emily, misunderstandings happen. I'm sure whatever business this is can wait. Interesting, I replied. A few minutes ago you said business should always be handled face to face. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Who was that man? I looked directly at her. Someone my grandfather trusted with his life. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly at the mention of my grandfather. He had spent years assuming I came from an ordinary middle-class family because I never corrected him. That assumption had made him careless. He leaned forward. Emily, let's be honest. Daniel told us your grandfather was a retired military officer. Respectable man, I'm sure, but why would an attorney call you chairwoman? Daniel immediately looked away again. My heart sank. He had been discussing my family behind my back. You asked him about my grandfather? I said quietly. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Dad was curious. No, I answered. He was investigating. Richard suddenly stood and picked up the contract from the table. This conversation is getting unnecessarily dramatic. His voice had hardened. Either sign the agreement tonight, or we postpone the real estate partnership we've been negotiating. Real estate partnership? I had never agreed to one. Before I could question him, another voice echoed from the front hallway. Calm. Professional. Unfamiliar. Mr. Carter?" A woman in a dark business suit stepped into the dining room beside two plainclothes federal agents displaying discreet credentials. Every face around the table turned white. The woman opened a slim folder and looked directly at Richard. "I'm Special Agent Laura Hayes. We need to ask you several questions regarding Crescent Ridge development, and we'd appreciate it if nobody leaves the house." Richard's hand instantly tightened around the contract. Then his eyes slowly drifted toward the sealed folder still resting beside my untouched Thanksgiving dinner, and for the first time in his life, he looked genuinely afraid. Nobody reached for their food after the agents walked into the dining room. The warmth of Thanksgiving disappeared as though someone had opened every window in the house. Richard Carter slowly lowered himself back into his chair, but the confidence that had defined him only minutes earlier was gone. His wife, Linda, clutched the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Daniel looked back and forth between me and the federal agents, confusion replacing the guilt that had shadowed him all evening. Special Agent Laura Hayes didn't raise her voice or flash dramatic gestures. She simply placed a thin file on the table beside Richard's untouched plate. "Mr. Carter," she said evenly, "this is not an arrest. Not yet. We're conducting an ongoing investigation into Crescent Ridge development, several shell corporations, and allegations involving fraudulent land acquisitions near federal defense property." Richard forced a laugh that sounded painfully strained. "You've made a mistake." Agent Hayes didn't blink. "We hope so. That's why we're asking questions before taking further action." The room fell silent again until Richard suddenly pointed toward me. "This has nothing to do with my family." Agent Hayes followed his finger, looked directly at me, then nodded politely. "Actually, Mrs. Carter may become an important witness." Every eye at the table shifted toward me. I hadn't spoken more than a handful of sentences all evening, yet somehow I had become the center of a federal investigation. Daniel whispered my name. "Emily, what's happening?" I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "I'm beginning to think the better question is, what have you been hiding from me?" Richard stood again, this time unable to hide the anger burning behind his carefully practiced smile. "Emily doesn't know anything about our business." Agent Hayes calmly opened her file. "That's interesting, because several confidential emails were covered through a federal warrant mention acquiring her inherited property before the Whitmore people discover what's underneath." The moment she spoke my grandfather's last name, Richard's face completely changed. It wasn't surprise anymore. It was recognition. Real, unmistakable recognition. I saw it before he could hide it. "You knew my grandfather," I said quietly. Richard remained silent. "You knew exactly who he was." Linda looked at her husband with genuine confusion. "Richard, what is she talking about?" He ignored her. Instead, he stared directly at me. "Your grandfather should have sold that land 20 years ago." His words came out before he realized what he had admitted. Agent Hayes immediately wrote something in her notebook. "Thank you," she said calmly. "That confirms part of our timeline." Daniel looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. "Dad, you've met Emily's grandfather?" Richard finally snapped. "Yes." His voice echoed through the dining room. "Before any of you knew her, I met Colonel Whitmore during a private acquisition meeting. He refused to sell. Said some land wasn't meant to belong to businessmen chasing easy money. Richard laughed bitterly. Stubborn old soldier. I slowly opened the sealed folder Harold Bennett had delivered. Inside rested only a single letter and one photograph. The photograph showed my grandfather standing beside Richard nearly 25 years earlier in front of my grandmother's lakeside cabin. Written across the back in my grandfather's handwriting were 8 chilling words: "Never trust Richard Carter with this property. Ever." Beneath the photograph sat another envelope marked, "Open only if Richard Carter approaches you first." My heartbeat slowed. Grandfather hadn't been guessing. He had been preparing me. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the handwritten letter while everyone watched in absolute silence. My grandfather's familiar handwriting filled the page. "Emily, if you're reading this, Richard has finally made his move. He believes the cabin is valuable because of the land around it. He's wrong. The cabin itself is the key. Hidden beneath it are military records that disappeared after a classified procurement investigation years ago. Those files expose powerful people who attempted to steal defense technology using fake development companies. Richard was never the mastermind. He was simply willing to help the real one." Before I could finish reading, Richard lunged across the table. "Give me that letter." Daniel grabbed his father's arm. Chairs crashed backward. Linda screamed. Vanessa stumbled into the china cabinet. One of the federal agents intercepted Richard before he reached me, forcing him against the dining room wall. "Don't make this worse," the agent warned. Richard struggled only for a second before freezing. His eyes never left the letter in my hands. Agent Hayes stepped closer. "Mrs. Carter, please continue reading." I lowered my eyes to the page once more. The final paragraph made my breath catch. "The man truly responsible wears respect like a uniform and patriotism like a disguise. If Richard ever comes after the cabin, understand one thing: he isn't searching for money anymore. He's searching for someone who believes those records were destroyed, because that someone has already risen to one of the highest positions in the country. And if this letter has reached you, that person already knows your name." I looked up slowly. Every face in the room had gone pale. Then the front door opened again, and a decorated 4-star general stepped inside, removed his cap, looked directly at me, and quietly said, "Miss Whitmore, we've been trying to protect you for 20 years." The room became so still that the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking steel. Every pair of eyes locked onto the 4-star general standing in the doorway. He wasn't surrounded by flashing cameras or an entourage of officers. He had entered quietly, carrying only a weathered leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. His uniform was immaculate, but it wasn't the medals that commanded attention, it was the expression on his face. It held the weight of a promise that had taken decades to keep. Agent Laura Hayes immediately straightened. Both federal agents stepped aside without a word. Richard Carter stopped struggling altogether. Even he recognized the authority standing before him. The general walked directly toward me, stopping only a few feet away. "Emily Whitmore?" he asked gently. I nodded. He extended his hand, not as someone greeting a stranger, but as someone honoring a commitment. "I'm General Nathan Brooks. Your grandfather saved my life during an overseas operation many years ago." Before he passed away, he gave me one final mission. He looked around the room before continuing. He told me that if anyone ever tried to force your hand regarding that cabin, I was to come personally. Daniel stared at me with disbelief. Emily, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I met his eyes, feeling the hurt behind his question. Because I promised my grandfather I wouldn't tell anyone until someone revealed their true intentions. Tonight, your family did exactly that. Richard let out a bitter laugh. You think an old soldier's stories will save you? That land belongs to progress. General Brooks turned toward him with icy calm. No, Mr. Carter. That land belongs to history, and history has a way of exposing everyone who tries to bury it. The general placed the leather portfolio on the dining table beside my grandfather's letter and slowly opened it. Inside were faded military maps, classified photographs, and several official documents stamped with security markings that had long since been declassified. One photograph immediately caught my attention. It showed my grandfather standing beside 3 other men at the lakeside cabin. I recognized General Brooks as a much younger officer. The second man was Richard Carter, nearly unrecognizable without gray hair. But it was the fourth face that froze the room. Agent Hayes inhaled sharply. Impossible, she whispered. The photograph showed Senator William Ashcroft, now one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, standing shoulder to shoulder with the others nearly 25 years earlier. Richard's face drained of every remaining trace of color. General Brooks spoke carefully. This picture was taken 2 days before a classified defense prototype disappeared during a federal procurement operation. The prototype was recovered. The official records were not. Agent Hayes looked directly at Richard. Crescent Ridge Development wasn't buying land for luxury homes, was it? Richard remained silent. You believe the missing records were hidden beneath the Whitmore cabin because Senator Ashcroft convinced you they were. Richard finally exploded. He promised nobody would ever connect it back to us. The instant those words escaped his mouth, he realized what he had admitted. Agent Hayes slowly closed her notebook. Thank you, she said quietly. We've been waiting 15 years to hear that sentence. Daniel stepped backward until he nearly collided with the wall. He looked at his father as though he had never truly known him. Dad, what have you done? Richard didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me with desperate eyes. Emily, listen to me. None of this was supposed to involve you. We only wanted the property. I folded my grandfather's letter with steady hands. No, I replied. You wanted to erase the last piece of evidence my grandfather trusted me to protect. Before anyone could speak again, one of the federal agents received a call through his earpiece. His expression changed instantly. He turned toward Agent Hayes. Ma'am. Washington just issued emergency warrants. Hayes nodded once before looking at General Brooks. The senator knows we've uncovered the photograph. General Brooks' jaw tightened. Then we're out of time. He turned to me. Emily, there is something your grandfather never placed in writing because he believed paper could be stolen. From inside the portfolio, he removed a small brass key attached to a faded military dog tag engraved with my grandfather's name. He told me to give you this only if the photograph surfaced. I accepted it carefully, confused. What does it open? The general looked directly into my eyes. Not the cabin. He paused, letting the words settle over the silent room. It opens a private vault beneath the original Whitmore Foundation headquarters in Virginia. Your grandfather secretly moved the real evidence years before anyone started searching the property. Richard's knees nearly gave out. No, he whispered. That's impossible. General Brooks shook his head. Your biggest mistake wasn't underestimating Emily. His voice became firm. It was underestimating Colonel James Whitmore. Just then, every phone in the room vibrated at the same time with breaking news alerts. Agent Hayes glanced at hers and immediately looked back at me. Emily, she said quietly, the senator has just resigned unexpectedly. Before anyone could process those words, the lights throughout the Carter home suddenly went dark, plunging the house into silence. Outside, the sound of tires screeching across the driveway shattered the night, and someone began pounding violently on the